is the Clark County Historical Museum's Arnada neighborhood tour. And the museum, what we do is we collect the history of Clark County, but not our only job is to just collect it, but is also to interpret that history. And that's what these tours are all about, is about bringing that history out for the community to interact and hear the stories of the different people that lived in different neighborhoods and have been prominent citizens around Clark County and Vancouver. So we're going to go ahead and walk this way, and we'll get started for today. And if anyone hasn't heard the history of the museum, at the end I'll be coming back and actually talking about the history of this site. But we're going to go ahead and get started by getting into the neighborhood right away. So we'll take a look at this building right here. This building was built around 1953, and this was the site. Now, actually, many of you may remember what this was before it was vacant. It was Timers. So it was for a photography shop. But originally, this was the state employment security office for the area. And there's an interesting history behind that, because what they did is they managed unemployment benefits for people. And the first time unemployment benefits were available in Washington State was around 1939. And this was due after several years because of the Depression in 1929, which caused great economic upheaval. And so the government saw necessity to be able to provide these kinds of safety nets. And so this office was established in '53 after the war, because after the war and the shipyards began to close and move on, there were a lot of people that were left unemployed in the Clark County and Vancouver area. And so there was quite high demand for these services. And the manager of this place was actually Jack McDonald, which Ken has a little story about.
Yeah, Jack McDonald was a very generous man. He was obviously Irish Catholic. He had a daughter who fell upon some hard times. She had 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls. And so Jack and his wife took in the 2 boys. They lived up in the Telecasset Heights. And the boys lived with their grandparents clear through high school. So Jack was a generous guy, a wonderful grandfather, and a great businessman as well. The reason I know this story is because my best friend was one of those boys. So, and so I knew Jack quite well, and he was a great guy.
Yeah, and he was a very active member of the community. And as Ken said, he was quite giving, and obviously his job required somewhat of giving, being that he was running that employment services department. So from here, we're going to go and head up, and we'll take a look at what is now Columbia Dams. So this whole block, and we'll talk about this on the way back the other side, this whole block used to be car dealerships and automotive shops. And the first owner of this shop was William Tiny Way. And he had this shop built for him in 1945. And Way actually owned a DeSoto used car dealership here at this spot. And he actually went into business for himself in '31. He had worked for different auto dealers around the area, and then eventually he decided to go into business for himself, and he retained the services of an architect, and he constructed this building right here that he ran for many, many years in the Clark County area. And in our most recent exhibit that we just took down, you can actually see one of Tiny's advertisements that he had in the local Columbian newspaper. So from here, we're going to go and head down, and we'll take a look at our first house in the actual neighborhood section of this.
The Arnada neighborhood has a lot of beautiful homes. Unfortunately, we can't see them all. A lot of homes with history. We've selected a route that we think gives you a good example of the architectural style and where some of the early business leaders lived. So pardon us if we don't go by your particular favorite house.
Yeah, and as we walk, we could talk about the streets here, that these streets weren't always named these exact names. Ken actually had a list of the names that they used to be called.
Yeah, 20th Street, when it was originally platted, was Commercial Street. 22nd was called Eastham. 24th was called Rand. And 25th was called Elwell.
Yeah, and we're not exactly sure the names behind that. That still leads to research, but the neighborhood's name has an interesting kind of folkloric story. It's said that there were 3 women who were architects, and that to name this neighborhood, they pulled portions of their name and made up the word Arnada. Whether that's true or not, it's not exactly easy to find, but it's an interesting story, and Vancouver's full of different folklore like that. Like if we talk about Providence Academy, it's said that Mother Joseph actually asked Lowell Hidden of the Hidden Brick Company to go into the brick business just so he could supply her bricks for that academy. Whether that's true or not, who knows? But it's an interesting thing, and it adds to the flavor of this community that definitely enjoys tall tales.
You can see that this neighborhood is a real mix, from houses 100 years old to houses that have been built within the last 10 years.
Yeah, in the early part of this neighborhood, a lot of these houses would have been spaced apart, and there would have been lots of space like this between the different areas. We'll go and cross here and get on the other side. And there's several streets in this Arnada Park area, in this Arnada neighborhood, that if you look around, and we don't know the exact location, but we've heard that there's lots of misspellings and different stuff on the corners of the roads when they were pouring the different sections. And unlike the Houck neighborhood, this neighborhood was really more of just working individuals and residential. In the Houck neighborhood, you had a lot of people running, big businesses, leaders of the city. Here was a little more of the working class in this neighborhood. And this is the Stapleton House. And this house was built in 1902. And it's noted that 1900 is the first record of this property, and it was 5 contiguous lots. And the 5 lots were sold for $1,080 a piece. And 2 years later, Mr. James P. Stapleton paid $630 for this lot right here alone. And a short history of the family reveals that Mr. Stapleton's parents crossing the plains by an ox team and settling in the Willamette Valley in 1871. So the Stapleton family has been around, and actually there's the Capel-Stapleton.
Yeah, there's a Stapleton Road, on the east side of town. It's kind of interesting, in the early part of the century, there was a streetcar that ran from Lower Main, came up Main to 26th or 4th Plain, jogged over, and then up K Street to 33rd. And at 33rd and K, you can still see this big sweeping arc where the curb is to make way for the streetcar. The streetcar then went out toward Sifton. That's where it ended, was Sifton, which is just east of Orchards. And one of the stops along the way was Stapleton.
Yep.
And so there were several stops that have been identified. It ran north of 4th Plain, basically paralleling 4th Plain.
Yep, and James Stapleton himself was a district court attorney in the area, and then eventually he became a circuit court judge in Portland. And he was known as the father of the Interstate Bridge, being one of the original promoters of the Portland to Vancouver span. And while in Portland, him and his wife continued to maintain a summer home in East Vancouver. So they still had these ties to the Vancouver area. So from here, we'll go ahead and head up, and we'll take a look at our next site.
Here you can see a mix of styles. We have a 4-square or prairie home on the corner here. Right next to it is a craftsman style home. Sometimes the 4 squares are referred to as prairie homes because that style of architecture was developed in Chicago in the early part of the 20th century.
And for a long time, Chicago architecturally was a center that people went to work. There was the Exposition in Chicago in the late 19th century that displayed a lot of different styles of architecture. So we'll go and pause right here.
Okay. Yeah, this building across the street from us was originally built by the Carpenters Union, and they leased offices out to a number of other unions, the Painters Union, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. Today there are no union offices left in this building. You can see it's for sale. I believe the last union office in that building was United Food and Commercial Workers Local 555. I think that was the last office in there. But for years, this was probably the last labor temple in Vancouver. Most of the unions, they moved their headquarters over to their Portland offices. So this is really the last labor temple. And by labor temple, I mean you have multiple unions renting space or leasing space in the building. We have a number of buildings downtown that were former labor temples. Someday we're going to do a labor walk, and we'll talk about those things. But I think this is noteworthy for that reason.
Yeah. And now as we get up here and we turn the corner, you're going to see one of the gems of the neighborhood that's very interesting that we just discovered recently. And at the same time, it's something that kind of epitomizes people in Clark County. And we'll see that as soon as we round this corner here. And actually you can get a little view of it from this angle. You'll see that there's a railroad car here in this individual's backyard. That is not uncommon in the county. It's a little uncommon in this neighborhood. But
in fact, I think it's the only one in this neighborhood.
One that I know of. And a lot of times when we get down in these neighborhoods, we end up getting put on assignment. So he said that he's talked to his neighbors and that there's some lore in the neighborhood that these trees here were actually the boundary for the barracks, and that there are other trees that mark off this certain area. Now, if that's true or not, we don't know, but you know, walking around, he's asked us to look into that. So that's something we're looking into.
He specifically named black walnut trees, and he claims that there are 4 corners where these black walnut trees are planted. I'm not sure if that's true or not. I live up on 40th Street. We have this big tree that's a black walnut, and I don't think it lines up with any of these.
It would have been the early period, 1850s to late 19th century. And it's not out of the realm of possibility, because as we walk up here, the next street, we're not going on it, but the next street up above is Reserve. And Reserve used to line the Reserve. So there was a stretch of that came all the way out to this portion. And you'll see, you know, with the completion of I-5, that Reserve Street got all cut up across the city. So now Reserve, when it used to continue, actually just ends here. And we actually have a map in the museum where you can see the whole entire Reserve uncut up. And here it looks like we have a descendant of the oldest apple tree in the Northwest. We also have one over at the museum. The apple tree next to it is believed to be a cutting from that also. And yeah, it's a pretty popular thing around Vancouver to have. And up here, I don't know any history about this house, but this is one of the most interesting homes in the neighborhood. It looks like a cottage, but it's built out of brick. And this is just the kind of thing that if you don't walk around a neighborhood, you would never realize that there's this kind of home that's just so interesting laying around.
You'll also see a lot of Cape Cod style houses throughout the neighborhood. That's a pretty classic Cape Cod across the street. Oftentimes the door will be centered exactly in the middle of the house, and the windows will be spaced evenly on either side. The roof pitch is fairly steep, and so that's a very traditional looking Cape Cod style house.
And that's just a sign of how these houses in the neighborhood were built at different times, and that the neighborhood didn't necessarily fill in rows, but kind of filled in piecemeal over time, where you had, you know, a house built here and then large pieces of land that were sold off, and then eventually other homes were built next to them. And this neighborhood and the Hauk one were the largest post-World War II developments in the area. And I think Ken has a story about getting some lumber coming up. We'll stop right up here.
You know, if you lived in Vancouver in the 50s or the 60s, and you had a remodel project, you wanted to get dimension lumber or nails or plywood, you go to your local lumber yard. We didn't have Home Depot or Lowe's. We had neighborhood lumber yards. And right here on this corner was Bork Lumber. You see the house, the second house from the corner? It's got that interesting curved roof design on the gable end. Throughout Arnada and Carter Park, you'll see houses that look very similar to that. And in our research, we've discovered that almost all those houses with that particular design were built between 1925 and 1935. And so I keep researching those because the house I lived in when I went to high school looks very similar to that. And it was built in 1926.
Yeah, and we have a suspicion that we need to be looking for a certain architect that may have enjoyed that style, but we've yet to find him. But he may be out there. And as we come up here, last week we mentioned briefly Dr. Leeser, and now we're approaching where his office used to be.
Yeah, this particular office here on the corner, I believe it was built in the 50s. It was built by 4 doctors, actually 2 physicians and 2 dentists. And one of the dentists in this office was Dr. Miles Leeser. Now, if you were on last week's tour, we talked a little bit about, he served in World War II, in Europe in World War II, and he was fascinated by the Volkswagen. And he brought the first Volkswagen back to Vancouver after the war. His father and 2 uncles were physicians here in Vancouver. His brother was Ralph. Ralph named Miles after his own brother, who had died during the flu epidemic. He thought very much of his brother, so he named his son after his brother. So we have Miles Leeser, the uncle, Miles Leeser, the nephew. But this was his office for many, many years. And then in the late 70s, he moved up to an office on Main Street in the Lincoln neighborhood.
Yep. And in our archives in the museum, we actually have an interview with Dr. Miles Leeser that you can read some of the transcript, and we're working to digitize those and make those available so you can actually hear the individual that worked in this building in his own words talk about his family's history and his own. So.
And by the way, that was my dentist. This house on the corner, this is a classic craftsman home. And you can tell by the exposed eaves, by the massive columns holding the front porch. And it was an architectural style in contrast to Victorian or Queen Anne. And you can see, oftentimes they would have the tapered columns, massive tapered columns. This big, beautiful home was owned by a gentleman by the name of Ray W. Lang. And so I was curious, what did he do for a living to have such a beautiful home? Ray W. Lang was an electrician. He worked for SP&S Railroad as one of his employers. He had a couple of other employers that we identified through the Polk city directories. But this was probably the finest electrician's home in Vancouver.
Definitely. And the house right next to here wasn't actually originally in this space. This is the John P. Kiggins home. And most residents probably recognize the name Kiggins for the Kiggins Theater, but John P. Kiggins was a multiple-time mayor of the city of Vancouver. He was a building contractor, and he was actually a huge supporter of labor. Kiggins went and actually did a fundraiser to help pay money to the families of some workers that were striking at one time. So he was definitely interested in that kind of stuff, but he was extremely interested in movie theaters, and he actually built the Kiggins Theater and the Castle Theater, which the Castle used to be down on Broadway, and it was a beautiful building. And Kiggins was actually a transplant from the East Coast, and he came out this way and ended up working in the military. And he, after his service, decided to stay in the city, and he built, quite a life for himself here. And this house he built in 1907, and this is a craftsman-style home. And this home was actually down where the new library is at, and it sat there for many, many years, and it kind of fell into a state of disrepair. And eventually, the owners that have taken this house now, purchased the house, paid to move it, and restored this house. And it is beautifully, beautifully restored. Interiors are all matched to the original, any restorations that they've done, and it's on the historic register. And it's just a gem of historical home architecture and of also a historical person in this community. And it's really, the people who live here are great stewards of this home. It's just an amazing house. So we'll go ahead and walk around here, and we'll take a look at Arnada Park.
Yeah, this is a site, this is Arnada Park, but this was the site of Arnada School, which sat here for over 50 years. It closed down in the early 60s. The building sat here for many years after that, and in fact, the students from Fort Vancouver High School used to come down here in the early 60s, mid-60s, and play intramural football on the grounds right here. And the school sat right over there. Obviously, they had to tear the school down when they revamped this whole interchange. It used to be 26th Street, which we now call 4th Plain, came right up to H, squared off and went straight down H. So when they revamped the interchange, they had to tear out the school, and what was left they made into a park. You know, one of the homes we're going to miss on this tour is in the 2200 block of F Street. There's a big two-story home, beautiful two-story home that sits in the 2200 block, and it was the home of Joe Olson. Now, those of you who have been around a while probably remember Olson Electric. Olson Electric was around for over 60 years, and Joe was the president of Olson Electric. And he lived in that home for decades, and he continued operating the business while he was well into his 80s. It no longer is in business, but there's a lot of notable project schools that were wired around Vancouver that Olson Electric did. They were like the shop, the largest shop in Vancouver for many years.
And hopefully by next year, well, this year is the first year actually, we're doing the Carter Park, which Ken has done an amazing job on, and we'll actually be going north of 4th Plain for the first time on our tours. And hopefully next year, because we've got the west side of that north of 4th Plain, and hopefully next year we're going to do the Shumway neighborhood and get east of that, of Main Street and up here. And the Shumway neighborhood, the one north of 4th Plain, is quite interesting because it was the site of the racetrack for the city. And the state didn't allow these things, but the city leaders of Vancouver kind of ignored those and just continued to have the racetrack up there for many, many years until it was shut down.
Remember, we had the only Army base in the state of Washington until World War I. We had a lot of soldiers stationed here at the barracks, and that was a great form of entertainment.
And Kiggins, the house we saw, was a great supporter of that form of entertainment. And actually, we won't walk past it, but if you make it back to the neighborhood, on the other side of the Kiggins house, as you walk down 24th, they actually have lined their brick wall with hidden bricks. And you can see the hidden and the year flipped up, and it's really neat. This is a beautiful representation of a Dutch colonial style home, and it was built to fashion things, and it was when they wanted to fashion things in the European style. And this was built in 1910, and in addition to inspiring the United States centennial celebration of 1876, Americans began to take interest in their past. And so when this house was built, it was during a period when there were lots of revival style homes. So the colonial revival, the Dutch colonial revival, Spanish mission revival, and it was a period of time when people began to start looking back at the past and wanting their homes to emulate those kinds of the past that we had in the country. And here we're going to go and head down, and we'll take a look at another one of these revival homes.
Across the street you can see there's another classic craftsman home with the big columns.
And as you can see here in the residential area, there was there was residential and then there were business. This obviously was built for a business at one point, and so it's definitely a mixed neighborhood.
On one of the other tours we talked about these things in the road. You'll see those throughout the west side of Vancouver. Anybody know what that's for? Yeah. Keep your horse tied up there.
And that was that was a big deal in the area. So in the 1870s, there was a report in the newspaper that the officers of the law in the city had to confiscate a prominent person's cow because it was loose and running around the town, and the person had to actually go to court to get the cow back. So those rings were quite vital to the community in the 1870s and even later on in the early 20th century, because the city had to actually work to pass ordinances to control people from letting their livestock run around the downtown and main parts of the city. Now here, as we come up to the corner, we're coming up to the hub of the Arnada neighborhood and also to a really beautiful colonial revival style home. And we'll go and stop on this corner here, and Ken will actually tell us about the occupant, which the name should be familiar to many of you. And if you're ever wondering what's going on in the Arnada neighborhood, you can always come and check out this board right here. They've done a really great job of having these centralized so that, you know, there's lots of community involvement. So we'll go and pause right here, and Kendall talked about the individual.
This home here on the corner was the home of this one right here. It's a colonial revival home. Very narrow eaves, fairly steep pitch roofs. It was the home of Gilbert Daniels. Now, Gilbert Daniels was the manager of Fletcher Daniels Abstract, which is like today's title company. But also, at one time, he was the cashier at Commercial Bank. That was the actual title. Gilbert is the nephew of W. Byron Daniels, and W. Byron Daniels was an early mayor and civic leader here in Vancouver. Daniels Street was named after W. Byron Daniels. This was his nephew, Gilbert. Well, in 1911, Gilbert was arraigned for accepting money into his financial institution when he knew that the banking institution was no longer solvent. Obviously, that's against the law to do that. And so we don't know what happened after the arraignment, but we did find a newspaper article that talks about his arraignment. So he's got a colorful past as well.
Yeah, and his family member Thurston Daniels was involved in publishing in early Vancouver, and if I'm correct, I believe he was also appointed at one point the governor of the Idaho Territory in the area. So the family was quite prominent in the area and even in the Northwest. So we'll go and head down here.
Post office.
Yeah, and if you go on our website and you look in our electronic archives and our photo collection, you can actually see a photograph in front of the annex of the employees that they took around 1958. And so you can see the employees that used to work here at the annex. And we actually have lots of photos of postal workers from all over Clark County in front of their buildings.
This was the home actually it's the home of Aaron Carlson right now. Say hello to the group, Aaron. And he's doing a great job of remodeling it, bringing it back to its original luster. But originally it was a home of John Egan. And John Egan, like so many early business people, he had his home and his business very close to each other. His business was next door. It was a grocery store. That was John Egan's grocery. Later, it was Mickey's Grocery. I don't know who Mickey is, but that's what he named his grocery store. So this is a great classic four square, and he's doing a great job of keeping it true to its history, and we appreciate you letting us see your house.
Thank you.
Aaron says this house was built in 1907. So we have no reason to doubt what he says.
And here now we'll go and stop and we'll look at these two, what used to be matching craftsman style homes.
These two craftsman homes obviously were built from the same set of plans. The home on the corner became a home of businesses, but the original family in this home was the Bennett family. The Bennett family still lives here after all these years.
Yep.
So, a great example of craftsman style.
And we'll go and walk down here and we'll take a look at some of our final sites for today. And these apartments, these were built around the 60s, right?
Yeah. When I was in high school, my best friend and I would drive by here and we always said, that's where we're going to live when we graduate from high school. Well, when I graduated from high school, that's where I lived.
And his best friend was the grandson, right?
Yeah, grandson of Jack McDonald, who we talked about earlier.
At the Employment Services Department. Now as you walk down, you'll see that there's just on this main road, there's a mixture of homes and businesses, because this originally was mainly a residential space where homes were built, and then eventually businesses filled in empty spaces, and also homes may have been taken out. And here we can see the back of the original Vancouver Creamery, which was that site right there. And then it was Evergreen Laundry after that. And then again, just a trademark of the neighborhood, you see newer style buildings, you know, 60s and 70s mixed with older homes that were a turn of the century. And one of the houses we didn't look at was owned by another Stapleton, Norval Stapleton, and he was actually a grocery owner, and he ran a grocery store at 1901 Main Street, which, if you've been on the last previous tours, you would know is Arthur J. Collins' grocery store originally, or Collings grocery store. And here we see the back of the Collings building right here, which was the grocery store that Stapleton had, and also Collings. And Stapleton was actually a partner with Herman Humbird was his partner in the grocery business. So here we come walking up to Paul's, and we'll wrap up on these next blocks right here. So here we'll pause one last time and we'll take a look at Paul's here and the elbow room. So this building was built around the 1950s or 60s, and at one time on this site was Rich Made Ice Cream. And Rich Made Ice Cream was actually a franchise style ice cream, and there was advertisements in the paper that you could own a 24 flavors ice cream shop or a Rich Made. And so the individuals at this site decided to go with the Rich Made, and they were here till the 1970s when Paul's moved into the building just up, and then eventually took up this whole block, and it was owned by Paul Bell. Now there are a couple interesting stories that I was able to find about Paul's. Now the first one was that there was the Clark County Pageant Scholarship that had been awarded in the 1980s, around 1985, to an individual, but unfortunately the board did not have the money to actually pay out the scholarship. So local businesses came to the rescue and went and did fundraising ventures to allow for the winner of the scholarship to have the money that she was awarded. And Paul's did this through selling chocolate-covered macadamia nuts from the store to get proceeds. And then a couple other businesses up at Tower Mall also did the same thing. Now that was a nice charitable thing that was done at Paul's, but there was also kind of some scandals that happened at Paul's. In the 80s, there was issues with gambling in Vancouver. And there was a year-long investigation that was done of several different locations, and it was found that the machines, the video poker machines, had been switched from credit to gambling mode, and that people were actually allowed to gamble. And Paul's, one of the places that had their video poker machine confiscated. Also, the Totem Pole restaurant, which is up in Hazeldale, had theirs confiscated also. So it was a bit of a scandal, and the people who owned the machines were arrested and jailed for about 3 years. And so there's a little bit of history behind Paul's restaurant that we have. And then we'll go and start walking back to the museum, and I think Ken will talk about the other half of the automobile dealership on this block.
This building with the corrugated metal on it was originally Gilbert and Seibel Volkswagen. So if you bought a new Volkswagen in Vancouver, this is where you bought it. It's kind of interesting to see how the auto dealerships progressed from the lower part of downtown up. Kitty corner from the museum is the old Foley Chevrolet. Next door, just to the south of the museum, was a Nash dealership. So we see these car dealerships moving up toward the north end of town. Eventually they're moving out to the east side.
I've done some research on the building that is now Burnt Bridge Wine Cellars, a really great place. And it used to be an auto dealer too. And at one point, one of the names was the Electric Motor Company or something of that sort. And I've yet to be able to research to see if they actually did electric cars at that point. It was quite early, I believe in the 40s and the 50s, that establishment was there.